It was a Wednesday in late May, the sort of mild, golden afternoon that made the village of Nether Whittleton look like something out of a country calendar. Honeysuckle coiled around the church fence. The chiming of the parish bell echoed softly as children tumbled out of school, and a cat, white with an uncertain ginger tail, tiptoed across the post office garden wall like it had somewhere important to be. At Lavender Tea, the small but cheerful tea room nestled between the ironmonger and the greengrocer, 3 tables were set for the weekly ladies' gathering. Inside, the scent of clove sugar biscuits and rosehip tea hung lazily in the air, stirred now and again by the slow-moving ceiling fan above. Mrs. Banbury, who owned the place, wore her customary pearl brooch and a frown of perpetual suspicion, though no one knew whether it was aimed at the tea leaves or the ladies themselves. Miss Marple sat at her usual spot by the window, knitting needles clicking in a measured rhythm. She wore pale blue that day, modest and pressed, with just a sprig of forget-me-not pinned near her collar. Though her eyes were soft, there was a clarity in them that never quite faded, not even when she was listening politely to Miss Dudgeon's latest tale of her gardener's misfortunes with cauliflower pests. Then the front bell rang, not the polite jingle of a regular customer, but a long, forceful clang. Every head turned. The man who entered was not from Nether Whittleton, that much was certain. He wore an olive-green overcoat, though the day was warm, and a pair of polished shoes that had not known village dust. His face was narrow and weather-worn, with a jagged scar tracing the edge of his jaw. But what was most striking, aside from his heavy silence, was how his gaze landed squarely on Miss Marple. He gave a slight nod, then walked over as though he'd been expected. "Miss Marple?" His voice was low and deliberate, with a clipped northern cadence. "Jane Marple of St. Mary Mead." The tea room fell quiet. Even the fan seemed to pause. Miss Marple, for her part, did not startle. She set her knitting aside and smiled gently. "Why, yes, you have me at a disadvantage, mister." He didn't sit. "I'll be brief. Someone's watching you, ma'am. Been asking about you for weeks. I thought you should know." And then, without waiting for reply or refreshment, the man turned and left. A moment later, the doorbell jangled again behind him, and he was gone, his coat flapping like a warning in the warm village breeze. Miss Dudgeon gasped, one hand to her teacup. "Well, I must say," Mrs. Banbury muttered something about tramps and nonsense, but Miss Marple only leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowing, not with fear but the cautious curiosity of a woman who had just heard something no one else truly grasped. Because what the man had said wasn't what unsettled her, it was what he hadn't said. He knew her name, her full name. He had looked at her not with awe or suspicion but familiarity, recognition, and for all her years of quiet observation, Jane Marple could not recall ever having laid eyes on the man before. Somewhere in her memory, something shifted like a page turning, but not yet fully open, not yet. Miss Marple remained still for a moment longer than necessary after the stranger left, her expression unreadable. A piece of her mind began tracing patterns, as it often did in the presence of the unexpected. She picked up her knitting once more, not out of any real intent to continue, but because hands in motion gave others less reason to stare. In truth, her attention had wandered entirely from her stitches. Across from her, Miss Dudgeon leaned forward conspiratorially, her voice a whisper soaked in thrill. "Well, Jane, I do declare that was the most excitement we've had since young Timmy knocked over the honey stall last summer. Who was he, do you think?" "I haven't the faintest idea," Miss Marple said mildly, still gazing out the window where the man had vanished into the bright afternoon. "But I suppose one doesn't need to know someone to be known by them." Mrs. Dudgeon blinked. "I beg your pardon?" Miss Marple didn't elaborate. She offered a gentle smile and returned her attention to her teacup, though she hardly sipped. Her thoughts were elsewhere, already turning over the peculiar phrasing, the tension in the man's shoulders, the unmistakable mark of unease that clung to him even more than the out-of-place coat he wore. A man who looked over his shoulder more often than ever. By the time the gathering concluded and polite chatter resumed, Miss Marple had resolved not to mention the incident further, not just yet. Idle talk, especially among village ladies, had a way of mutating truth into dramatic fantasy. She preferred her clues unclouded. That evening, back in her ivy-clad cottage with the garden smelling sweet from lilac blooms, and the soft ticking of the mantel clock filling the room, Miss Marple pulled out her diary. She was not one for melodrama, but she had learned long ago that patterns only emerged if one took care to record even the most minor anomaly. She wrote, Wednesday, 22nd May, Lavender Tea 3, warned that someone has been asking about me for weeks. No recognition on my part, no introduction on his. Demeanor, serious, possibly anxious, not local, departed swiftly, did not drink. She paused and underlined one word twice. Weeks, not days, not recently. If the stranger was to be believed, someone had taken an interest in her with purpose and time. She closed the diary softly and turned to wind the clock. The night was unusually still. A faint breeze creaked a floorboard upstairs. Nothing unusual in an old house, but it did not help settle the feeling in her chest. A feeling she had not had in years. Not fear, precisely, but the sense that something had quietly shifted course, like a carriage veering off the usual village lane. The following morning brought bright sunshine and an ordinary routine. Miss Marple watered her violets, wrote 2 letters, one to her niece in Torquay, and one to the vicar's wife confirming her help for the upcoming charity fete, and set off on her morning walk to the post office. As she passed the green, she paused. There, parked oddly at the side of the bakery, was the same olive green coat. It now hung loosely over the arm of a bench. The man sat beside it, hunched over a newspaper, a paper bag of pastry in his hand. He looked no more relaxed in daylight than he had yesterday. This time he noticed her first. Miss Marple, he said without rising. She approached calmly. Good morning. If you don't mind, I would very much appreciate an explanation. He glanced around. A dog barked in the distance, and a lorry rumbled by down the hill. Not here. Not in public. I'll come by later. Your cottage, it's up behind the churchyard, isn't it? She regarded him quietly. It is. I won't stay long, he added. I promise you this isn't something I wanted to bring to your door, but you've been named, ma'am. That's all I can say right now. And again, without waiting for further question, he stood, folded his paper with unnecessary care, and walked off down Mill Lane. That evening, at precisely 6:30, he arrived. Miss Marple had already set out the tea tray, not because she expected him to drink, but because propriety mattered even when dealing with mystery. He hesitated at the threshold, then stepped into the sitting room, eyes sweeping over the chintz curtains, lace doilies, and the unassuming porcelain figurines that guarded her bookshelves. You can call me Hawkins, he said, remaining on his feet. Not my real name, but good enough for now. Miss Marple gestured politely to the wingback chair. Well, Mr. Hawkins, then, do sit. He did, stiffly, as if unused to comfort. I work occasionally, he began, with people who know how to ask the right questions in the wrong places. People who trace things others want forgotten. Usually it's fraud, missing heirs, hidden trusts, nothing to do with ladies in villages, sipping rosehip tea. And yet, Miss Marple prompted, pouring him a cup he did not touch. And yet, he continued, a name kept coming up. Yours, Jane Marple. Quietly, in circles where quiet isn't polite, it's dangerous. She gave no reaction. Her calmness seemed to unnerve him more than any alarm would have. A woman in London hired someone to look into a spinster lady in St. Mary Mead, with an unfortunate habit of noticing. That's a quote. Miss Marple smiled slightly, flattering in its way. She paid handsomely, asked for a discreet inquiry. But the thing is, she wasn't just curious. She was frightened, and not frightened of you, but for you. That made her pause. Go on. Hawkins leaned forward. Whatever she knows, it's tied to something from years ago, something someone buried very deep. This woman claimed to have uncovered an old secret that could get people hurt if it came out. She wouldn't say more, only that before she could speak to anyone else, she wanted you warned. Did she give a name? No, he said, but she left one message for you, written by hand. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a creased slip of paper. Miss Marple accepted it gently, her fingers surprisingly steady. The note read, in a firm, slanted script, tell Jane Marple, the Ashford matter was never solved, but I have the photograph now. Ellie. Miss Marple sat perfectly still. For a long moment, the ticking clock was the only sound in the room. Then softly she said, Ashford. Hawkins watched her, waiting. A name I haven't heard spoken in nearly 40 years, she murmured. And even then, not in public. She folded the note carefully, almost tenderly, and tucked it into the pocket of her cardigan. You've done what you came to do, Mr. Hawkins. Thank you. He frowned. But shouldn't I stay? Shouldn't? No, she said kindly, but with a finality that brooked no argument. This is no longer your thread to follow. He stood uneasy. I hope you'll be careful, he said. She smiled. Always. After he left, Miss Marple did not move for a long time. The sun had set, and her tea had gone cold. But in her mind, the puzzle pieces began sliding gently into view, rearranging across the years. The Ashford matter, a name buried under time, a photograph, and a woman who feared for her life, not because of what she had done, but because of what she knew. Jane Marple rose slowly from her chair and walked to the window. Outside, the street lamps flickered on one by one. Somewhere in London, someone had reopened a secret that had been locked for decades. And now it had come home. Miss Marple sat at her small kitchen table, sipping tea that had long gone tepid, her toast forgotten on its plate. The note lay beside her, its edges slightly curled from where she'd unfolded it too many times already. The Ashford matter was never solved, but I have the photograph now. The handwriting had stirred a trace of familiarity, something she couldn't quite pin. It wasn't the name Ashford itself that had haunted her dreams the night before, but what wasn't said, the buried memory of a place, a child's face, a heavy silence after a tragedy, politely dismissed by everyone at the time. She left the house before 8:30, cardigan buttoned up to her throat despite the warming sun. Her destination was not far, just past the duck pond, and beyond the white-painted fence of Fern Cottage, where Reverend Sims lived with his books and his quietly inquisitive wife, Margaret. The Simses had only been in the parish 3 years, but Miss Marple had long since learned that a vicar's wife, regardless of tenure, knew every whisper before it reached the vestry. She found Mrs. Sims deadheading petunias near the gate. "My dear," Miss Marple said with a smile, "what a glorious morning for secrets." Mrs. Sims looked up, blinking behind her spectacles, then laughed softly. "And I've got plenty, Jane, though most involve who forgot to return the hymn book." "Not this time," Miss Marple said, and lowered her voice. "Do you by any chance recall hearing the name Ashford mentioned in connection with our village, or perhaps someone by that name passing through long ago?" Mrs. Sims paused, thinking. Ashford. Not a family I know personally, though I do believe there was an Ashford girl, Lillian Ashford. I remember the name coming up when we were organizing the church records for the Historical Society. Quite a long time ago though. The early 50s, I think. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Lillian, yes, that rings a bell. Was there any incident, anything that required the church's attention?" "Well, now that you mention it," Mrs. Sims said, lowering her shears and removing her gloves, "there was something odd in the baptism record. Reverend Blythe made a rather cryptic note about a service that was scheduled and never took place. A young girl, unmarried with a child. But the entry was struck through, no reason given. That always struck me as unusual." Miss Marple's eyes twitched almost imperceptibly. "Would you mind terribly if I looked at the old parish logbook myself? Just a bit of curiosity that's taken hold." Mrs. Sims smiled. "Not at all, Jane. You know the vicar's an open book literally. Come in, I'll make some coffee." They moved into the cottage, and soon Miss Marple found herself seated at the large oak writing desk in the vicar's study, an aging ledger open before her. The ink had faded in parts, and the vellum pages crackled when turned. Her fingers stopped at a line dated October 7, Ashford of Fairley Cottage. Baptism scheduled for infant son Matthew, 10 a.m. Struck through. Beside it, in different ink, a later note, service cancelled. Mother relocated. Infant, no longer in parish. R. Blythe. Miss Marple tapped the page with her fingernail. She remembered Fairley Cottage. It had been torn down in the 60s after a fire. The details were coming clearer now, like a photograph developing in slow water. A scandal had quietly churned through the village back then, but it had never reached the surface. An unmarried mother, a child, and then both vanished, as if by careful design. She closed the book gently, thanked Mrs. Sims, and walked back through the village. Her thoughts turned not to the past, but to the stranger from London who had slipped that note into her hands. Why, after all these years, What could possibly be emerging from such an old, withered tree of secrecy? She returned to her cottage and sat once more in the sitting room, staring at the fire grate. Though it held no flame, she didn't have long to dwell. At precisely noon the post arrived, delivered with the usual cheerful efficiency of young Tommy Craddock, who tipped his cap and handed her 2 envelopes. The first was a circular from the Women's Guild. The second bore no return address, but was stamped London W1, and the envelope had a wax seal, old-fashioned and cracked. She opened it slowly. Inside was a photograph, black and white, grainy, but unmistakably taken from a distance. A young woman, no more than 18, stood holding a child in her arms at what appeared to be a train station. Her face was angled downward, partially obscured by her bonnet, but Miss Marple felt the jolt all the same. The photograph was dated. There was a slip of paper inside the envelope as well. It read only, "They lied about the baby." Miss Marple sat back, lips pressed tight. She looked again at the child, no more than 6 months old, and then at the surroundings. In the background a sign, Pancras Station, northbound and platform. Lillian Ashford hadn't vanished. She had left, but someone had seen to it that no one asked why. Miss Marple wasted no time. By 2 o'clock she was seated across from Constable Roger Feltham, in the modest local police outpost. Feltham, barely 30, and rather overconfident in his starched uniform, was clearly not expecting her visit. "Miss Marple," he said brightly, "I hope there hasn't been any unpleasantness." "Not yet," she replied smoothly, "but I've come across something that may involve an unresolved matter from the 1950s, a disappearance that was quietly explained away at the time. I wonder, might I trouble you to look into any unsolved inquiries from that decade, particularly involving a Miss Lillian Ashford, or her child?" Feltham furrowed his brow. "That's rather a ways back, isn't it?" "Time doesn't always bury everything," she replied gently. "Sometimes it merely allows lies to grow comfortable." He scratched his head. "Well, I suppose I could ask county records. Might take a day or two. Not much from those days has been digitized." "Of course," Miss Marple said, standing. "But do call me at once, if anything peculiar comes up. I believe this may be rather more serious than it appeared." As she made her way home through the lengthening shadows of the late afternoon, a sudden thought stopped her just outside the butcher's. She turned on her heel and walked straight to the library instead. The librarian, Mrs. Egerton, was trimming catalogue cards and looked up with surprise. "Back again so soon, Miss Marple? I'm looking for something very specific," she said. "Do we have local newspaper archives from 1952? Miss Marple settled herself before the machine and began scrolling. The reels whirred faintly, the faded columns passing like ghost stories beneath the lens. She stopped at October, scanned line by line. Then she saw it. A brief article, barely 5 lines. "Unscheduled fire damages, Fairley Cottage on the outskirts of St. Mary Mead. No injuries reported. Property declared uninhabitable. Tenants listed as relocated by landlord." There were no names, no follow-up, just smoke and silence. She sat back, heart steady but heavy. The photograph, the warning, the sudden fire, the struck through baptism. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase Lillian Ashford and her child from the village's memory. But now, decades later, someone had started digging again, and they had made sure that Jane Marple would be the first to know. The next morning arrived with grey clouds knitting themselves low across the sky, casting a quiet hush over St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple awoke early, her sleep having been visited by half-formed memories, and the unmistakable pull of a mystery that had not only resurfaced, it had been summoned. By whom and to what end she had yet to determine. She dressed methodically, and allowed herself only 1 cup of tea before setting out, slipping the envelope with the photograph into her handbag along with the handwritten note. Her destination today was not the library, nor the post office, but a cottage she hadn't visited in years, not since before it changed hands and its history was delicately forgotten. She walked past the village green, turning down a narrow lane lined with elderflower hedges, until she reached a gate so warped it no longer latched. Beyond it stood what remained of Fairley Cottage, or rather the new dwelling built atop its scorched foundation. The fire had claimed much of the original structure, and the rebuilding effort in the 60s had softened its angles and replaced soot with fresh plaster. But a house Miss Marple knew never entirely shed its memories. The current tenant, Miss Elsie Brent had moved into the property 5 years prior after the passing of her husband. A cheerful widow, Elsie kept a tidy garden and a notorious stash of rhubarb gin in the pantry. She was just finishing with the compost bin when Miss Marple arrived. Well, if it isn't Miss Marple, come to see what a widow does with her roses when no one's watching. Miss Marple chuckled, stepping through the gate. Actually, I hoped I might ask you something rather odd about the house. Oh, you mean this old place? Elsie brushed her gloved hands on her apron. Strange little thing, isn't it? Always creaks at night, no matter how much I tighten the boards. Thought it was mice at first. Has anyone ever told you about what happened here before it was rebuilt? Miss Marple asked gently, eyes scanning the brickwork. Oh, just that it caught fire, Elsie said. I assumed it was wiring or some such. These country homes can be terribly unpredictable. It was more than that, Miss Marple said, drawing out the photograph. Do you recognize this young woman? Elsie adjusted her glasses and studied the image. No, I don't think so. Poor thing, she looks frightened, doesn't she? Was she here? She lived here briefly with an infant. In 1952, Elsie looked up, suddenly quieter. I see. Miss Marple gave her a moment. Then carefully she asked, have you found anything unusual, perhaps during gardening or rearranging? Old items, papers, anything that felt out of place? Well, Elsie hesitated. Funny you mention it. There was something. The spring I moved in, I was clearing out the crawl space under the old pantry place. Still had some stonework from before the rebuild. There was a tin box wedged between two bricks, damp and rusted, barely held together. What was inside? Miss Marple asked calmly. Only bits, really. A lace ribbon, a small rattle, a scrap of paper I couldn't read. The ink had bled. I nearly tossed the lot, but something about it felt. She trailed off. Well, it didn't feel right to throw away someone's memory, if that makes sense. It does, said Miss Marple quietly. Elsie stepped inside and returned a moment later with a biscuit tin wrapped in an old tea towel. I've kept it tucked behind the stairs. Didn't know who to give it to. Maybe you'll know what to make of it. Miss Marple unwrapped it slowly, almost reverently. Inside lay the lace ribbon, yellowed but intact. A baby's rattle, wooden, hand-painted, chipped with time, and a single torn envelope. The letter was gone, but the flap remained on it in neat handwriting for Lillian, to open when she is safe. Miss Marple traced the name with her fingertip. She never opened it, she murmured. She must have hidden it before she left, perhaps even hours before the fire. She left in a rush then. Elsie, possibly. Or someone else made sure she did. Miss Marple thanked her and took the items home, wrapping them once more and placing them beside the photo. Each object was a ghost now. Each whispered a story someone had gone to great lengths to silence. By the afternoon, the clouds had opened into a steady drizzle. Miss Marple returned to her study and rang the county office to inquire again about any historical records tied to Lillian Ashford, citing possible family research. It was a white lie, but not without purpose. She was told she'd hear back in a day or two, as most documents from that period were stored off-site. She had just put the receiver down when the knock came. 3 taps, sharp, intentional. She opened the door to find Hawkins again, Rain clinging to his coat. I said I'd be gone, he offered, but then they started asking questions about me. So I came back. Miss Marple motioned him in and offered a towel. Who exactly is they? She asked once he was seated. 2 men, he said, rubbing his hands. City type, pretending to be insurance agents, but too vague for my liking. One of them asked directly whether I'd spoken to the spinster from St. Mary Mead. Their words, not flattering but accurate, I suppose. Indeed, she said dryly. They were looking for something, Hawkins continued. Not just Lillian. They kept circling around a name I hadn't heard before. Greville. Ever come across it? Miss Marple's hand froze mid-pour. Yes, she said slowly. Not often, and not in years, but yes. Bernard Greville. He came through the village in 1951, shortly before Lillian arrived. Claimed to be visiting his aunt. Did he have one? No, she replied, and no one knew where he went after. Hawkins leaned forward. The woman in London, she believed Lillian's child wasn't just an embarrassment to a family. She believed he was evidence of something tied to people like Greville. People who worked in shadows. Government? Miss Marple asked. Worse, he said. Private hands. Intelligence passed on like coin. Greville may have done more than charm a village girl. He may have used her, left her vulnerable to eliminate a loose end. Miss Marple's eyes darkened. And if that's true, she said softly, then whoever's searching now isn't just after a memory. They're after proof that something was hidden, and perhaps never buried completely. Hawkins nodded. Someone's afraid this is all surfacing again. And you, Miss Marple, are now standing at the center. She folded her hand. Then I shall have to stand very still and listen very carefully. That evening she sat by the fire, a quilt over her knees, the photograph and the baby's rattle laid out before her like clues in a quiet war. Outside, the rain continued, and far away, in some grey corridor in London, or Paris, or perhaps only a little further than the next village over, someone who remembered the Ashford matter was growing restless. Because Jane Marple, the quiet woman who noticed everything, was beginning to remember too. The storm rolled in that night, not with fury, but with a brooding persistence. Low thunder, soft wind brushing the ivy against the panes, and a drizzle that had no intention of stopping. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple sat beside the hearth with the fire drawn low. Her reading glasses perched on her nose, though she wasn't reading. She was listening. Hawkins had gone an hour earlier, insisting he would stay at the inn in Much Deeping for the night. Too many eyes here, he'd said, his voice tight with something she recognized. Not fear, but vigilance. The rain made her memory clearer somehow. There had been more about Bernard Greville. She could picture him now, faintly handsome in a slippery way, all compliments and borrowed charm. He had arrived just before Michaelmas, giving vague stories about being in publishing. A man with a watch far too fine for the bus he claimed to ride. And Lillian, sweet, intelligent, but isolated, had seemed immediately smitten, or vulnerable. It had been that autumn when the whispers started, that she'd fallen pregnant, that her aunt who had taken her in, had suddenly stopped speaking to neighbors, that Greville had vanished without explanation, but no one had asked real questions, not when shame was easier to bear than scandal. Miss Marple rose and moved to her bureau. Inside the drawer beneath her sewing box, she kept a set of old letters, many from friends long gone, and some from correspondence of a different kind. Tucked between envelopes was one from a former acquaintance, Alice Denham, who had worked for years in domestic service before quietly becoming one of the country's most discreet and thorough private researchers. They had shared tea once in 1968 when a mutual friend had passed, and Miss Marple had never forgotten the sharpness behind her modest smile. She pulled out a sheet of fine paper and began to write. My dear Alice, I wonder if your keen memory and sharper instincts might still be of help. I am seeking any known affiliations, however unofficial, between a Bernard Greville, c. 1925, any reference to incidents involving Lillian Ashford or Fairley Cottage in South. He may have been operating under assumed circumstances in the Kent or Hampshire area. Alice Denham had always thrived in the unspoken corridors of forgotten truths. By morning, the rain had passed, leaving puddles that mirrored the swollen clouds overhead. Miss Marple ventured out early, stopping by the post office, where she slipped the letter into the box with a deliberate motion, knowing full well that her actions were now likely being observed, if not by the villagers, then by those with a longer reach. The rest of her day she spent in her garden under the guise of tending to her bulbs, but her mind was entirely elsewhere. She was waiting. The waiting ended with a telephone call just past 4 o'clock. It was Constable Felth. I've had something from the county records office, he said, trying to sound casual. It's not much, but I thought you might want to hear it in person. She agreed at once, and made her way to the station by foot, preferring the silence of her own thoughts to the noise of the bus. Inside the constable's cramped office, Feltham waved her to a seat and set a slim file before her. Not many papers survived from those years, but they did find one entry, a report filed by a Reverend Blythe, dated 2 days after the fire at Fairley Cottage. Its handwriting says he believed the fire was deliberate. Miss Marple leaned forward. Did he say why? Feltham nodded. He mentions a visitor to the parish, A man who had taken unusual interest in the Ashford girl claimed he was her fiancé, but Blythe said he never once saw him speak kindly to her, said he asked probing questions, insisted the child was not his, and that he was far too well dressed for an honest man. That's his phrase. She smiled thinly. A poetic judge of character, Reverend Blythe. Feltham looked uncomfortable. The report goes on to say he feared for Lillian's safety. He wrote that she appeared agitated the last time he saw her, and that she had confided she planned to leave, but she never came to collect her belongings from the rectory. So he knew she meant to run, Miss Marple murmured. And yet no one searched for her. No missing persons case was ever filed, said Feltham. The records stopped there. Miss Marple stood. Then thank you, Constable, you've done quite well. If anything else comes through, you'll be the first to know, She made her way back as the clouds broke again, and pale light slanted through them in long strips. The pattern was forming now, unmistakable in its quiet design. Someone, Greville or the men who came after, had intended to erase Lillian, not only from the village but from the official record. But she had survived. Somehow, enough to send a message to Miss Marple, or to enlist someone else who could. That someone might now be in danger. When she reached home, she found a telegram waiting. From AD Info confirms link to defunct office, known as Vane. Greville listed under 3 aliases, 2 missing persons associated, connects to LA via St. Pancras records, 1952. Advise caution, letter to follow. Miss Marple read the message twice. Vane. She remembered hearing it once during the war, spoken in a breathless whisper by a woman who had translated encoded documents and died quietly in a boarding house. 2 years later, Vane House had been unofficial, a private operation functioning in the shadow of the larger intelligence agency, a place where inconvenient truths could be locked away if the price was right. And now it was surfacing again. At 6:30, a second knock came to her door. This time it was not Hawkins. A young woman stood there, her hair damp, her breath visible in the chill. She held a battered satchel and looked as though she had been traveling for hours. There was something strikingly familiar about her. The eyes, wide and pale gray, the angle of her chin. "I'm sorry," the woman said, her voice catching. "I didn't know who else to trust." Miss Marple studied her quietly and then stepped aside. "You'd better come in, my dear. You've come a long way, and I believe we have a great deal to talk about." The woman entered hesitantly and sat where Hawkins had the night before, her fingers tightening around the strap of her bag. "I'm Emily," she said after a pause. "Emily Ashford." Miss Marple's breath stopped, just for a moment. "She was my grandmother," Emily said. "Lillian. She died 6 months ago. But before she did, she told me everything." Miss Marple did not speak right away. Instead, she let the silence settle gently around them, offering the girl, the young woman, a few moments to breathe, to orient herself after what must have been a journey driven by more than trains or roads. Emily Ashford sat with her back straight, but eyes uncertain, as though still unsure if she had done the right thing in coming here. "Your grandmother was very brave," Miss Marple said at last, "and very clever. I only regret that she carried her burden alone for so long." Emily's fingers loosened on the satchel. Her face was pale from fatigue, but her gaze was steady now. "She didn't want to tell me at first. She said some things were better left buried, even if they never stopped haunting her." "Did she tell you everything?" Miss Marple asked gently. Emily shook her head. "Not everything. Just enough that I knew she was in danger once, and that someone had helped her disappear. She made me promise I wouldn't try to find out more until she was gone. But after she passed, I found something tucked inside her old knitting bag." She opened the satchel and carefully drew out a small leather-bound diary. Its spine was cracked, the pages swollen slightly from age and damp, but the name Lillian Ashford was written neatly on the inside cover. Miss Marple leaned forward as Emily opened the book and turned to a marked page. "She wrote this the day she left the village," Emily said. "It's short, just a paragraph." She handed the diary to Miss Marple, who read the entry in silence. "October 9th, 1952. He said the child couldn't live, that no one would believe me, and even if they did, he'd already made sure I would be blamed. I hid the photograph. I burned the letters. I don't know if I'll survive this, but I can't let them have my son. They're not after me. They're after him. If anything happens, Jane Marple will know what to do. Miss Marple's fingers lingered on the page. She felt the weight of it settle like a stone. Do you know who she meant by them? She asked. Emily nodded slowly. But the name Greville came up again and again, sometimes in the margins, sometimes as just an initial. My mother never spoke of her father. She always said it was better that way. But one of the letters my grandmother had hidden mentioned Vane House. I searched for it online, and there's barely anything, just fragments, but it kept coming up alongside a string of disappearances. People who knew something they shouldn't. Your mother, Miss Marple asked carefully, was she Matthew's sister? Emily gave a faint smile. No, she was Matthew. Lillian changed her name when they fled. She raised her daughter as her niece to keep the story from following them. My mother only found out the truth after she had me, and by then it was too late to trace anything back, or so we thought. Miss Marple absorbed the information with calm precision. It was the final piece she needed to see the full shape of what had been hidden for so long. The Ashford child had been the true target, not because of shame or scandal, but because of something tied to the father, Bernard Greville, who had woven himself into a web far more dangerous than village gossip. And now Emily had unknowingly stepped back into that web. You said someone helped your grandmother disappear, Miss Marple said. Did she say who? Emily hesitated, then pulled out another item from her satchel, a faded photograph, creased at the corner. It showed two women standing side by side. Lillian, unmistakably younger, her face weary but composed. Beside her was another woman, smiling, arm looped gently through Lillian's. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. It was Alice Dent. She didn't give me her name, Emily said, but she said a friend of a friend had come from London, someone who had seen what was coming and knew how to make people vanish without a trace. She said the woman only asked for one thing in return, that if the day ever came when someone came looking again, she was to send word to St. Mary Mead. So you've done exactly as promised, Miss Marple said. Emily nodded. I didn't know if you'd still be here, or even alive. Oh, I'm quite alive, my dear, Miss Marple replied, her voice laced with just a trace of wry humor. And it seems I have work to do. She stood and moved to her writing desk, retrieving the letter she had sent to Alice, only the day before. She glanced at the clock. If Alice had received it this morning, she might already be preparing her reply. I must ask you something rather serious, she said, turning back to Emily. Has anyone followed you? Emily looked startled. I don't think so. I took the train from the coast and changed twice. I didn't give anyone my name at the inn in London. No men in suits asking strange questions. Not that I noticed, but I have been getting calls with no one on the other end. Miss Marple sighed quietly. They know, or at least they suspect. I imagine the photograph you found was the last straw. Emily nodded. I mailed it to you from a box in Brighton, just before I left. I didn't want to risk carrying it. Smart girl, Miss Marple said, but it means they may already be on their way here. She paused, then she walked to the sideboard and picked up the baby's rattle, the one Elsie Brent had found in the crawl space. She held it out to Emily. Your grandmother left this behind, perhaps in her haste or perhaps because she feared it would link her to what they were hiding. I believe your mother once held it. Emily took it slowly, her hands trembling. She never had anything of her baby years. Gran said they lost it all in a fire. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Some things endure. The clock chimed 6. Outside, the rain began again, soft and persistent. Miss Marple turned to the fire, stirring it to life. We'll need to make plans, she said, more to herself than to Emily, because now that the child has returned, so too will the shadows that tried to erase her. Emily sat in silence, clutching the rattle to her chest, the diary resting on her lap like a long-closed door now slowly opening. And Miss Marple, watching the flames flicker in the grate, knew that the past was no longer content to remain in the past. It had come knock, and it would not leave quietly. The fire had burned low by the time Miss Marple rose from her chair. Emily had drifted into a light doze, curled on the settee with a blanket tucked around her shoulders, the diary still resting in her lap and the rattle gripped loosely in one hand. There was something painfully fragile in the way she slept, like a child who had crossed a battlefield only to rest just beyond the front lines. Miss Marple moved silently through the house, pulling the curtains tight and checking the latch on every door and window. She did not often feel uneasy in her own home, but tonight her senses were heightened, alert in a way that reminded her of wartime, when each knock on the door could mean telegrams, secrets, or something worse. The village was quiet, the lanes still, but it was the kind of stillness that seemed to listen. She lit the small lamp by the kitchen and sat at the table, pulling a thin notebook from the side drawer. She began listing the pieces she knew for certain: names, dates, location. Lillian Ashford, 1952. Fairley Cottage. The fire. The photograph at St. Pancras. Greville. Vane House. Alice Denham. And now Emily. She drew a faint line between Greville and Vane House, then circled the word Greville. If Alice's telegram had been accurate, Greville had not operated alone. 2 people had vanished after contact with him. Now a third had died. Lillian, though by natural causes, and her granddaughter had surfaced carrying the weight of what he'd tried to bury. But what exactly was it that they had all tried so hard to hide? She set her pen down and went to the front hallway, opening the small wooden box beneath the stairs. Inside was a stout black umbrella, a pair of worn gardening gloves, and tucked beneath a tartan scarf, an envelope she had not touched in nearly 15 years. It was Alice's writing on the front: "For Jane, should the past ever wake." Miss Marple took it out and returned to the kitchen. She broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet inside. "Jane, if this ever reaches you, it will mean that someone has stirred the ashes of. You may remember the name Bernard Greville. What you likely never knew was that he acted under instruction, privately contracted, unofficially sanctioned, tasked with eliminating a trail that led to something far uglier than an unwed village girl. Lillian Ashford wasn't collateral. She was her child in particular was the true threat, not to safety but to reputation. Greville vanished in 1953. I later discovered he had been moved to Argentina under a different name, that someone else stayed behind, someone who continued to monitor the Ashfords. I never found his name. If the child or grandchild resurfaces, they won't be met with silence. Be careful, the quiet ones are always watching. Miss Marple read it twice. The phrase "continued to monitor" repeated in her mind. She thought of Hawkins, his clipped speech, his sudden appearance, his reluctance to share a real name. He had brought information, yes, but he had also stayed close. Had he come to protect Emily, or was he watching something else entirely? She would have to find. It was nearly morning when Emily stirred. Miss Marple had already dressed, and was warming porridge on the stove. "I dreamt about her," Emily said softly, sitting up and brushing hair from her eyes. She was holding me, but we weren't in the flat where she raised me. We were in a railway station. She kept saying, 'Don't let them see the baby,' over and over. 'Dreams remember what we don't,' Miss Marple said gently. 'Sometimes they carry fragments meant for us to reassemble.'" Emily rubbed her eyes. "Do you think Greville is still alive?" "I doubt it, but his successors almost certainly are. And if Vane House had ties to private intelligence, then they're the sort who never leave a file unfinished, especially one that involved betrayal, hidden lineage, and someone who might speak too loudly now." Emily nodded slowly. "I'm not going back to London, not until we finish this." Miss Marple smiled. "That's why, but finishing it will mean shaking the tree a little harder than they expect." After breakfast, Miss Marple telephoned Alice. Her housekeeper answered, her voice warm but cautious. "She's not in, I'm afraid. Took a call very early this morning, then left without explanation. Said she had to check a detail before sending the full report." Miss Marple thanked her and hung up slowly. "Alice is digging," she said to Emily, "and digging is dangerous when the ground is already cracked." They spent the morning indoors reviewing Lillian's diary again, searching for overlooked clues. Emily read aloud entries from 1953, notes about fear, about changing names, about a woman called Mrs. Elmsworth, who had arranged safe housing. Miss Marple blinked. "Elmsworth," she whispered. "Yes, she worked briefly as a midwife in London, moved to Surrey, then disappeared from the public registry. She must have been part of the network Alice used." By midday there was a knock at the door, gentler this time, 2 firm taps followed by 1 pause. Miss Marple opened it with the chain still on. It was Hawkins. His expression was taut. "I need to speak with both of you. Now, not on the road, not at the inn, here." Miss Marple studied his face and nodded once, undoing the chain. He stepped inside and removed his hat. Emily sat up straight. "I had someone trace a call that came to the inn last night," Hawkins began. No voice on the line, but it was routed through a switchboard used by former Vane affiliates. It originated near Fleet Street. London Press? Miss Marple asked. Possibly, or an office posing as such. The call was to check your presence. They're trying to verify if Emily's still in the country. Emily's voice was steady. What will they do if they find me? Hawkins looked at her. Depends on how much they think you know. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. And how much you think she knows? Hawkins hesitated. Enough to be dangerous, and enough to be a target. Then we must give them something else to look at, Miss Marple said. A misdirection. A story they expect. One that draws them out. She stood and turned to Emily. You're going to disappear again, my dear. Only this time, we'll be the ones writing the ending. Outside, clouds gathered once more. The wind picked up gently through the hedgerows as if stirring the pages of a book long sealed. Inside the cottage, plans were already taking shape, and far away in a city office where shadows answered only to silence, a phone rang twice and stopped. The past had awakened, and this time, it remembered everything. The first phase of their plan was deceptively simple because that was how it had to appear. Complexity attracted attention, but misdirection, when executed with the steady hand of an old woman known only for her quiet routines and fondness for hydrangeas, could pass unnoticed even under scrutiny. Miss Marple spent the next day making what seemed to be ordinary preparation. She visited the greengrocer, exchanging a brief complaint about the cost of new potatoes. She walked to the post office and mailed 2 envelopes, one addressed to a fictitious cousin in Devon, the other to an actual retired solicitor in Brighton, who had once owed her a favor from a matter involving a misappropriated will. And she stopped at the vicarage, where she left a small box of biscuits for the upcoming church fete, then asked after the newsletter printing schedule. By all appearances it was just another Thursday in St. Mary Mead. But Emily Ashford did not leave the cottage that day. She remained upstairs, where Miss Marple had refashioned the small guest room to look long abandoned, with dusted-over ornaments, and no sign of life. Hawkins, meanwhile, disappeared into the background entirely. Whether he was watching, guarding, or hunting, Miss Marple wasn't sure, but she knew his kind moved best in shadow, and for now that suited her. The real heart of their plan was planted that evening, just after the street lamps flickered to life and the last of the village dogs was called in for supper. Miss Marple stood alone at her gate, a scarf wrapped neatly around her shoulders, and greeted Mr. Simpkins, the butcher's assistant, as he passed on his bicycle. "Oh dear," she said, adjusting the scarf with theatrical concern. "I suppose the London papers will have quite the headlines tomorrow." Simpkins slowed. "What's that, Miss Marple?" She smiled just faintly. "A young woman, a visitor really, not from here, is giving an interview about an old story. Something from the Cold War day. Quite a to-do, I understand. I shouldn't say more, but, well, it seems not all secrets stay buried." He blinked. "Here in the village?" "Oh, not directly, but nearby. She's staying with a cousin, I believe. Near Bath. They say it might make radio." By the time Miss Simpkins was halfway down the lane, the bait had been planted, and with St. Mary Mead's gossip chain being what it was, the seed would reach the right ears before morning. Back inside, Emily sat at the window, watching the light dim through a gap in the curtain. "I don't understand," she said. "Why hint at a story? Won't that just draw more danger?" "That is precisely the point," Miss Marple replied, settling beside her. "We're not hiding anymore. We're baiting a response. They've been watching too long, first you, then me, now Hawkins. They want to know what we know." Emily frowned. "So we make them believe we know more than we do?" "No, dear," Miss Marple said gently. "We make them believe we're ready to say it." Later that evening, Hawkins returned. He entered without knocking, his coat wet from the drizzle, and his expression more grim than usual. "They've taken notice," he said without ceremony. "There's movement from a contact I've been tracking. London, formerly with the Office of Retired Intelligence and Trade, or though it hasn't existed officially in years. 2 men were sent to Bath, late this afternoon, using rental identities from a flagged agency." Miss Marple nodded, unperturbed. "Then they took they think Emily's there. One of them asked for her by birth name at a local B&B, and when they discover she isn't," Emily asked, eyes wary. Hawkins looked to Miss Marple. "That's where your timing mattered." Miss Marple reached into her side table drawer and retrieved an envelope. "I've written a letter," she said. It will be delivered anonymously to a retired journalist in London, someone with a long memory and a short temper. Inside, he'll find part of the story, just enough to stir curiosity, not confirmation. I suspect his name still triggers attention in a few back offices. Hawkins raised an eyebrow. You're flushing them out. I'm giving them a choice, she corrected. Silence me quickly, or come forward and ask nicely. Either way, they'll leave a trace, and we'll be ready. That night, Miss Marple allowed herself only 4 hours of sleep. She rose before dawn and watched the fog move like a curtain across the village lane. She brewed strong tea and laid out her papers again, rearranging the dates and initials. She paused over the name Greville once more. Then, with a soft click of realization, she circled a note she had nearly overlooked, an address scrawled in the corner of one of Alice Denham's old letters, 22 Wetherell Mews. It had been dismissed at the time as a safe house location for a minor operation. But now Miss Marple wasn't so sure. She sent a quick message to Alice through Hawkins, asking whether that property had been connected to any known aliases of Greville's or his so-called successor. By midday, the reply came. Alice's voice on the telephone was low and tight. Jane, I believe the man behind the surveillance is still using that address. He's registered under a company that has 2 staff members, both tied to Greville's former network. One of them was likely the man who set the fire in 1952. And you're certain? I'm sending you the file now. But Jane, please don't approach them directly. I never approach anything directly, Miss Marple said. I simply stand where others forget to look. She hung up and turned to Emily, who had joined her at the table. We're very close now, my dear. Emily looked down at the rattle in her hand. Will it change anything, knowing who they were, what they did? Miss Marple considered the question carefully. Yes, she said at last. It will change you, and in time, that may change everything else. That evening, a final envelope was prepared, not to a journalist, not to the police, but to the current tenant of 22 Wetherell Mews. Inside was a single photograph, Lillian, holding the baby, standing at St. Pancras, and a note written in Miss Marple's delicate script. We have the original. The child lives. The truth will follow unless we meet. St. Mary Mead, Sunday noon, Church Lane, come alone, or be seen. She sealed it. By now, she thought, they would know the name Marple very well, and they would know what happened when she invited someone to tea. The envelope was posted first thing Friday morning, discreetly without fanfare slipped into the red letterbox by the station, as Miss Marple made her usual circuit past the grocer and the bookshop. She wore gloves, not from any wish to conceal fingerprints. Such dramatics were unnecessary, but simply because the morning chill had returned and her hands, like her habits, preferred comfort. By midday, the entire village had begun to stir with a hum of something unspoken. The butcher's assistant mentioned a man in a dark coat asking about a cousin from London. The vicar's wife found an unfamiliar pair of shoes at the rear of the chapel garden before they vanished. Even the innkeeper's boy reported seeing a man standing too long by the war memorial, not reading the names, just watching. Miss Marple took it all in without comment. Hawkins returned that afternoon. He looked as if he'd slept with one eye open, and perhaps They took the bait, he said simply. Your letter was collected by hand, delivered directly to the man registered as R. Malden. Real name, according to Alice, is Jeremy Greaves. Former intelligence cleaner, took over for Greville after the transfer to Argentina. He's kept a low profile for years until now. Then we'll see what shade of man he's become, Miss Marple said, smoothing the corner of her tablecloth. Whether he still prefers shadows, or if age has made him cautious. He'll come, Hawkins said, but not alone. Men like him never do. I expect as much. That's why he'll be met on a lane with only one bench, 2 hedges and a view that never lies. She didn't ask Hawkins to stay. She didn't need to. He remained anyway, taking up a silent vigil from the cottage across the lane, its owner conveniently gone to visit her daughter in Basingstoke. A kettle was left in the kitchen, a pair of binoculars on the upstairs sill, and one of Miss Marple's jam tarts resting in the tin. Even watchers, she believed, thought better on a full stomach. Saturday passed with the heavy quiet of held breath. Emily remained indoors, writing down everything her grandmother had ever told her. Names, places, even feeling. Because Miss Marple had said, emotion is the thread that ties the lie to the truth. A timeline is not enough. We must understand motive. Emily had nodded, biting her lip, her pencil moving slowly across the page. At dusk, a phone rang. Not Miss Marple. It was the landline at the inn.
The call lasted 42 seconds. The innkeeper later claimed the voice had no accent and no warmth. He asked only one question: "Is the woman from London still there?" The innkeeper had hesitated and replied as rehearsed: "She left yesterday, took the early train back, said she'd found what she was looking for." There was silence, then a simple thank you. The line went dead. By the following morning, the village square was unusually quiet. Sunday bells rang hollowly in the damp air, and the roads were slick from overnight rain. Miss Marple dressed in her usual manner, plain coat, gloves, sensible shoes, and walked to the church just before 11. She remained for the service, her gaze steady, her prayers sincere but alert. Emily stayed behind, tucked safely in the upstairs room, a note in her pocket, with the emergency number Hawkins had arranged through one of his contacts. She wasn't afraid, she was waiting. At 11:45, Miss Marple stepped out of the church and made her way toward the East Lane, a gravel path that curved behind the chapel garden and ended at a wooden bench beneath a crooked elm. The man was already there. He sat with one leg crossed over the other, reading a folded copy of the Times. His coat was pressed, his hair clipped short, his posture relaxed, but too perfect, the kind of ease that belonged to someone trained to vanish if need arose. She approached slowly. "Mr. Greaves," she said, her voice light, pleasant, almost apologetic. "Thank you for coming." He looked up, and for a moment said nothing. His eyes scanned her face, then the lane behind her, then the fields beyond the head. Satisfied she was alone, or confident he had backup, he set the newspaper down. "You're a difficult woman to ignore, Miss Marple," he said, "which is remarkable considering how hard you try to appear otherwise." She smiled. "That's the blessing of old age. One becomes invisible to those who prefer action over observation." He didn't smile back. "You sent a photograph," he said, adjunct. "A threat?" "No threat," she replied gently. "And a threat?" "No threat," she replied gently. "An invitation. I believe it's time for honesty. I've been honest for longer than most." "Indeed," she said, taking a seat beside him. "But not recently." He turned toward her slightly. "What is it you think you know?" Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. "Only that a young woman, Lillian Ashford, was targeted not because she was a liability, but because she was a witness. Her son, your superiors feared he might someday have reason to question his origin, and that his mother might have proof." Greaves said nothing. His stillness was confirmation enough. "You burned the cottage," she continued softly. "You or someone like you, but she escaped, helped by people who understood what you were. She survived. Her son survived, and now her granddaughter knows everything." Greaves inhaled slowly, but didn't deny it. "You'll find nothing admissible," he said. "No files, no orders, not even a photograph left in the vaults. Vane House is gone, and the past is not something anyone has the right to prosecute."
"I'm not here to prosecute," Miss Marple replied. "I'm here to end it." That made him pause. "How?" She turned to him fully. "By letting you do what you came here to do. Clean up, remove loose ends. Only this time, you don't do it with silence or disappearance. You do it with something simpler: acknowledgement." He raised an eyebrow. "A confession? No, a confirmation. One that will never see court or paper. Only a private exchange between yourself and the girl. So she may know that she is not mad, that her grandmother was telling the truth, and that someone in the darkness remembers it." Greaves stared at her for a long time. "You're asking for closure, not justice." "I'm asking for peace," she said. "The kind you never find if you keep killing the truth." He said nothing for a while. Then he folded the newspaper in half, reached into his coat, and withdrew a small envelope. He handed it to her. "There's a number inside. Not mine, a voice line. She can call once. Someone will answer. Someone who knows the story as it was told. No names, no recordings. But it will be enough." Miss Marple took the envelope, tucked it into her sleeve, and rose. "I assume this means your interest ends here." Greaves's gaze followed a bird crossing overhead. His voice was flat. "Mine does. But I can't speak for others." She nodded once. "Then let us both hope they've grown tired of shadows." He stood, collected the newspaper, and without another word, walked away down the lane, his steps neat and unhurried, like a man catching a train he already knew would arrive. Miss Marple returned home by the long path. She handed the envelope to Emily, who held it as if it were glass. "Will they leave us alone now?" she asked. Miss Marple exhaled gently. "I don't know, but you'll never again be left in the dark." And upstairs, as the bell struck noon again across the fields, the past began for the first time in 70 years to settle, not vanish, but settle. She did so from the back room, where Miss Marple had drawn the curtains and placed the rotary telephone, an old model with a satisfying weight, on the little writing desk that once belonged to her father. Hawkins sat in the kitchen with the radio turned up slightly, his eyes trained on the narrow view of the street, where twilight crept in behind the hedgerows. Outside, the village remained quiet, the kind of stillness that always followed resolution, but not yet peace. Miss Marple stood behind Emily as she dialed the number. There were 3 rings, then a voice, neither male nor female, clipped and accentless. "Yes?" Emily's breath caught for a moment. Then she said carefully, "You know who I am." A pause. "My grandmother was Lillian Ashford. I was told I could speak to someone who knew the truth." Another pause. Then the voice spoke again, measured, but gentler now. "She protected you. She sacrificed more than you may ever fully understand." "I want to understand," Emily said. "I want to know what happened. Not in theory, not in riddles." "She was marked by accident," the voice said. "A man with influence, Greville, used her for cover. There was an internal breach, documents mishandled, names connected. Someone realized she knew more than she should. The order came down to remove her from circulation." "Circulation," Emily repeated bitterly. "But someone intervened," the voice continued. "A woman named Denham arranged for her to vanish. It cost her a career. It saved a life. Greville vanished soon after, but the operation continued. Low-level monitoring, surveillance, until your grandmother sent the photograph. Until you picked up the trail." "Was she in danger again?" Emily asked. "No. By then, the threat had grown bureaucratic. A file no one wanted open. You didn't threaten lives. You threatened silence. That's what frightens institutions the most." Emily hesitated, then said, "Why tell me this now?" "Because one of us decided the past had taken enough. You needed to know that she wasn't paranoid, that her fear was earned, and that her choice to vanish was not madness, but courage." "Was there ever a file on me?" "Yes, there's a final note on it now. Closed by request." Emily swallowed, tears pressing behind her eyes. "Will someone else open it?" "Not if you stay silent," the voice said. "Not if you never try to prove any of this." Emily looked at Miss Marple, who nodded, slowly. "I don't want to prove it," Emily said. "I just want to carry it." There was silence on the line for a moment longer. Then the voice said, "You already are," and the line went dead. Emily set the receiver down. For a while she didn't move, and Miss Marple didn't rush her. At last she turned to the older woman and whispered, "That's all? That's really all?" Miss Marple touched her shoulder. "Sometimes the truth arrives like a storm. Sometimes it arrives like a breath. Either way, we must find our footing afterward." Hawkins came in soon after, closing the door softly behind him. 2 watchers packed up and left just after the bells, he reported, London bound. "Didn't even stop for lunch. I'd wager your line's been cut clean." "And you?" Miss Marple asked. "I'll stay one more night," he said, "but I think we've heard the last of them." That night was the quietest yet. No knocks, no calls, only the sound of the wind pushing gently against the shutters and the occasional owl passing low over the rooftop. Emily slept in the guest room, the envelope still under her pillow. Miss Marple stayed awake in her sitting room with her knitting, the firelight flickering across her calm, determined features. Just before dawn, she rose and opened her notebook one final time. She turned to the page marked Ashford and drew a careful line beneath the last entry. Then, on the next page, she wrote Emily Ashford, born from silence, freed by courage. May her future remain unobserved. In the morning, Emily packed her satchel. She dressed not as a fugitive or an orphan of buried scandal, but as herself, whoever that might become. There was a lightness in her now, one that came not from victory, but from clarity. "I'll go back to Brighton," she said, sipping the last of her tea. "Back to my life, but I'll write to you." "You must," Miss Marple said. though I expect your life may take you far beyond Brighton, once you've had time to breathe." Emily hugged her tightly at the gate. She whispered something then, something only for Miss Marple, something about grandmothers and courage, and the kind of love that leaves fingerprints, even when all else is burned away. Hawkins drove her to the station. He didn't say much, but she thanked him twice, once for what he had done, and once for what he hadn't. By the time Miss Marple returned to her parlor, the post had arrived, a single envelope with Alice Denham's handwriting. Inside was a final report, succinct, efficient, and annotated with delicate precision. Greville's successor, Jeremy Greaves, had indeed deactivated the line. Vane House's last ledger was closed, and Alice herself was retiring. Properly this time, she wrote, and with great relief. Miss Marple folded the letter and placed it in the back of her drawer, behind the older ones. She poured herself a fresh cup of tea, glanced at the daffodils beginning to stir beyond the window, and picked up her knitting. The village of Mary Mead had returned to its old rhythm. Children on bicycles, letters in brass slots, church bells calling the hours, but something had changed. Not in the sky, or the wind, or even in the quiet rooms of the cottage. Something deeper. Some old wound had been closed with care, and Miss Marple, content in her chair by the fire, was no longer waiting. She was remembering, and at last, she was letting go. Tulips opened in Mr. Bartlett's garden with near-military precision, and the war memorial had been freshly scrubbed by the Women's Guild in preparation for Founders Sunday. To the casual observer, nothing had changed, but Miss Marple, of course, noticed everything. There was a stillness about her now, not of stagnation, but of resolution. A certain weight lifted from her shoulders, a steadiness in her gait. She no longer glanced behind herself while walking down the lane, nor paused at sudden footfalls behind her. The danger had passed, not through luck or bluffing, or even through force, but through a slow, relentless unraveling of the truth. Thread by thread, she received a letter from Emily 2 weeks after her departure. It was postmarked from Edinburgh, not Brighton, and written on paper thick enough to suggest permanent. Emily had decided to remain up north, for a while at least. She'd found a room above a florist's shop, and taken work as a researcher in the city archives. There's something comforting about history, she wrote, to sort through fragments of the past, and finally place them where they belong. I used to run from it. Now, I feel I can give it back to others without fear. Miss Marple kept the letter folded inside her notebook, not as a case file but as a reminder. It was a few mornings later, sunlit and cool, when Constable Feltham appeared at her door, cap slightly askew, face flushed from cycling uphill. "I thought you should see this," he said, passing her a cream-colored envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of official stationery. It bore the watermark of the Cabinet Office, though no signature, typed neatly in the center. "Miss Marple, the matter is now closed. Thank you for your discretion." She read it once, said nothing, and handed it back. Feltham shifted awkwardly. "I'm not entirely sure what it means." "It means," she said gently, "that someone wants to ensure we know nothing further will come of it, which for once I am content to believe." He nodded, relieved without understanding why. When he left, Miss Marple returned to her chair by the window. The morning was still young. She had lemon biscuits cooling in the kitchen, and a volume of Thackeray open beside her, but her mind was not quite ready to rest. There was one final piece, one question that had never been directly answered. Why had they been so afraid of Lillian's child? Why had they hunted shadows for 70 years? The answer had been hiding all along, not in the names or the dates, but in the Miss Marple retrieved her notebook again, flipping back to where she'd written Greville's connections, the web Alice had uncovered, the aliases, the movements, and then she saw it, what had eluded her before. Greville hadn't just used Lily. He had passed through 3 countries under different names, attaching himself to women who matched a particular profile: quiet, overlooked, unmarried, often young. He had always been gathering something, not love, not companionship, cover. Lillian had been one of several, but she was the only one who'd slipped through, and in doing so, she'd carried more than embarrassment for him. She'd carried knowledge, or worse, proof, perhaps a document, perhaps only a memory of names, faces, a meeting over hers. Enough that, should her child ever come forward, someone might listen. Lillian had sensed it even then.
that the threat wasn't to her, but to the child who might one day speak clearly enough to be believed. That was why she'd run, why she'd hid at, why the others, Greville's associates, had kept watching. But the real danger had always been the possibility that the lie might be named out loud, not exposed in a trial, but simply said. Now it had been, and nothing had happened. Miss Marple closed the book. In the end, there had been no arrests, no names in the papers, no headline justice. That was not how such matters resolved themselves, and that was precisely why they had come to her. Because justice for the powerful was rarely a courtroom, it was quiet acknowledgement, reluctant truth. A phone call answered in a voice that would never admit to anything but still told the truth, just once. Later that week, Miss Marple hosted tea in her garden for 3 of the village ladies, who marveled at the new blooms and commented on how relaxed she seemed of late. "It must be the air," said Mrs. Dudgeon, sipping her tea. "Something's different in the air this season. Perhaps it's simply the weather," Miss Marple said, smiling. "Spring has a way of clearing old dust." After they left, she remained at the garden table, listening to the bees hum lazily through the hydrangea. For a long moment she thought of Lillian Ashford, not the frightened girl who had vanished one October morning, but the woman who had survived it all in silence, whose story had finally reached a listening ear. And she thought of Emily, standing in some northern library, breathing freely for the first time in her life. The sun passed through the apple branches, casting lace across the tabletop. It was over. The case, if one could call it that, had never borne the shape of a traditional mystery. There was no body, no dramatic confrontation, no moment in a drawing room, with every suspect present, but there had been a crime, a long one, a quiet one, and now it had been named. That was justice enough. Miss Marple rose, dusted her hands, and went inside. There were flowers to press, letters to reply to, and a kettle just beginning to sing. She had done what she always did. She had noticed what others missed, and in doing so, she had helped the truth find its voice.